Good evening. I'm Pamela NEWKIRK, and I have the pleasure of introducing this panel. We're calling it Paris Noir, but we're actually focusing on the African-American presence in Paris over the past century. And so for more than a century, legions of African-Americans have marveled at this city's warm reception and relative reprieve from racial hostility. Even 3 decades before World War I, the Philadelphia native Henry Ossawa Tanner moved to Paris and became a globally acclaimed artist with his painting, The Raising of Lazarus, winning a medal in the 1897 Paris Salon. It was purchased by the French government, and Tanner was made an honorary Knight of the Legion of Honor, France's highest award for his achievements. And of course, Madame Josephine Baker remains one of the most revered women in France. The St. Louis native, a year and a half ago, became the first woman of color and only the 6th woman inducted in the Pantheon, the country's mausoleum of revered historical figures. And where else can you board the metro at a stop named Ella Fitzgerald and disembark at Gare Rosa Parks, a rail station replete with a mosaic that honors the civil rights legend? There's a park named for the Reverend Martin Luther King, squares for Josephine Baker and Louis Armstrong, and a plaque recognizing Richard Wright outside the Latin Quarter apartment building where he once lived. The stalls along the Seine are a veritable shrine to African-American jazz legends whose images grace vintage books, albums, CDs, and posters heralding their appearance in Paris decades before. But this embrace of African Americans and their culture is not experienced by other Black and brown people from the former French colonies in Africa and the Caribbean. As I wrote in a recent essay in the Times, quote, "Even as I'm captivated by the city's extravagant beauty, I'm reminded of the plunder of places and people that its grandeur reflects." So as we explore the history and legacy of African Americans in Paris, I hope we'll also interrogate this tension between France's colonial past and the unique status and history of African Americans in Paris today. And for this conversation, we're so fortunate to have Doctors Farah, Jasmine Griffin, and Bob O'Meally, distinguished professors from Columbia University. Woo! We have parish transplants and writers Audrey Edwards and Jacques Lamar. Dr. Regine Michelle Jean-Charles, who's the Director of African American Studies at Northeastern. And Dr. Tiffany Gill, who's an Associate Professor at Rutgers University. So I hope you'll take a moment to review their impressive bios, and I lovingly urge them to respect the time limit to allow time for a discussion and questions. As I just said to someone, going over time is not a victimless offense. And with that, I will turn the mic over to Dr. Farah and Dr. Regine.
Yes. Thank you so much, Pamela. Thank you, Deb, all my love and admiration, as you know. So for Regine and I, Black Paris has been a series of encounters with ideas, images, histories, and most importantly, encounters with people. A series of encounters and exchanges through time passed between teacher to student, and in turn, as teachers learn from their students. So during my senior year in college, the pioneering scholar, Michel Fabre, served as a visiting professor of African American Studies at Harvard University. He was invited there by Werner Sollers, and I was encouraged to take his class. Fortunately, it was taught in English because I did not speak French. I studied Spanish as a student, but I took Professor Fabre's class. It was on African American expatriates in France. I wrote a paper. He liked the paper. I got an A. He cited it in his book later on, and he told me if I ever made my way to France, I could stay in his apartment downstairs from his house in Square Montsouris here in the 14th, I think. Many people stayed in that apartment. I did. I made my way to France with little money and less French, and planning or pretending to study African American expatriates in France. I'd written a paper on Black women in the City of Lights, Maya Angelou, Andrea Lee, representations of, and Diane Carroll's character in Paris Blues. But when I got here, it was encounters with, oh, there's that image, yeah. It was encounters with Black people who lived in Paris, not expatriates, who really made my time here. These are what I call vernacular portraits. These are photographs that I took, including there was my little apartment, and there was one of Professor Fabre's students, Regine, who was from Guadeloupe, and taught me how to use the metro and where to buy baguettes and how to make my way through the city and who to avoid, and took me to parties and helped my rudimentary French and taught me how to order at restaurants and really made me feel safe in this city and gave me a sense of home here. She'd also spent some time in Guyana with Maurice Bishop and taught me about that conflict and what had really happened there outside of the American newspapers. The other pairing that you see are two women who I did not know, whose names I did not know, but who saw this stupid American on the metro and told me that my purse was open, and then stepped outside the metro and helped me and were just so generous, and I took their picture and sent it home to my mother to show that, yes, your ridiculous daughter is actually safe because there are people here who look like you and your sisters who look out for her. And then there was a young man. That's all I'll say. And then my housemate, as you can see, with the exclamation points. He called. We'll move on. Yeah, we'll move on. There. So, yeah, we do. So there's not much to tell. It was just, you know. But yeah, encounters. So when I became a professor later on, I encouraged all my students to, one, study French, and to come to France, come to Paris, and to not only study African American expatriates, but to study Black people who lived here, who either were immigrants or who had been born here or had been here for generations. And I was fortunate enough to meet many students, but especially Regine Jean-Charles, who already had the language, and I could live vicariously through her. And I will now turn it over to her, who will finish our presentation.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. I'm going quickly, so I won't do all the thank yous. So during my sophomore year, Farah gave me the novel Sarah's Psalm, which was written by her friend Florence Ladd, who is here somewhere, also who's up there, I think. And Sarah's Psalm is a novel about an African-American woman who travels to Senegal while she's in graduate school and then moves there permanently later on. So while Sarah's Psalm is a love story between two people, it's also about a woman falling in love, a scholar falling in love deeply and unexpectedly with their object of study. Vivid descriptions of life in Dakar in the 1960s and detailed portraits of Senegalese culture, Sarah's Psalm captured an important moment in African and diasporic history. The novel takes the familiar trope of return and layers on topics like feminism, religious fundamentalism, and the intersection of class and racial politics. So when I read Sarah's Psalm, I said, oh, well, of course I'm going to study abroad in Senegal. And Farah was on board with that plan also. Unfortunately, my actual parents were not on board with that plan. They were immigrants themselves from Haiti, and they had certainly anticipated that I would study abroad, but they told me that I had to go to Paris. And I'll never forget how my father put it. He said, before going to the colonized, you have to go to the colonizer. And I was shocked, especially because my parents are very proud Haitian immigrants. They're so proud of their history and their heritage, their language, all of which they had taught me when I was growing up. And so I just didn't understand where this, what I perceived as Francophilia, was coming from. And I felt like to love Haiti, you had to reject France. And so I judged them, and I was very upset, but they were paying, so I had to, if I wanted to study abroad, I was gonna go where they told me to go. So when I landed in Paris, I shared my frustration with a friend who's actually in one of these pictures here. She was a student at Columbia, and she was the child of diplomats, and she'd lived in the Middle East, she lived on the African continent, and she was very excited to come to Europe, and specifically Paris, because she wanted to make a documentary about hip hop in Paris. And she thought, she was one of the first people that was like, oh no, it's fine. Like, you're gonna be fine in Paris. There are lots of black people. And sure enough, everywhere I went, I encountered this vibrant Afro-Parisian culture. I encountered it in clubs, dancing to soukous and compa and zouk. I encountered it in restaurants where I ate mafe and poulet yassa. I heard people on the radio singing. You can go through, oh, thank you. There were folks that were on the radio rapping and also singing. We went to protests. We went to hair shops in Chateau Rouge. We went to rap concerts. We went to breakdance competitions. Much of my education during that semester was through this lens of popular culture and in these informal experiences and encounters. But I also attended cultural and intellectual events. I frequented L'Harmattan, the bookstore, and Présence Africaine on Rue des Écoles. Troubled by Senghor's poem Femme Noire, I decided to write about the representation of gender and representations of women in the works of Aimé Césaire, Léopold Sédar Senghor, and Léon Gontran Damas. And because I went to Paris instead of Dakar, I encountered the capaciousness of the Black presence. And that shaped the trajectory of my entire career. So I ended up doing my doctorate in Romance languages and literatures at Harvard with the goal to study race, gender, and feminism in the French-speaking world. And when I lived in Paris the second time during graduate school, I continued to complement my formal education with informal experiences, many of which, again, took place in restaurants and clubs, but was also in conversation with several amazing Black, French, Afro-Parisian women who became among my closest friends. And so since that first encounter with Black Paris 25 years ago, I now regularly teach a Black France class in both French and English. My goal is always to expand my students' views of Blackness, challenge their view of Frenchness, and encourage them to learn in both formal and informal channels. And like me at 20 years old, and like Farah when she was an undergrad, they're clubbing, and sometimes the gentlemen do sometimes interfere. Other encounters get in the way of their coursework. But my pedagogical approach to Black France always centers the creative and intellectual work of Black women, whether those are historical figures like the trailblazing Nardal sisters, novelists like Calix Biala, Leonora Miano, Marie Ndiaye, activists like Assa Traoré, public intellectuals like Rokhaya Diallo, whose film we saw yesterday and who was here earlier today, or scholars like Maboula Soumaoro. Oh, is that the time? Does that mean my time's up?
No.
I'm over here. So, and I do have to say, we watched films like Marianne Noir, Saint-Omer, which is playing right now by Alice Diop in the other room, Trop Noir pour être française, Ouvre la voie by Amandine Gay. These are all text films that are being created by Black French women. And so while it's true that Papendiaï's inaugural text, La Condition Noire, in 2008, provided a framework for examining the heterogeneity of the African diasporic configurations of France's Black population, in my view, this field is truly animated by the Black women thinkers and Black feminists. It's the women for me. Oh great, I have lots of time. From the feminist organization Afrofemme to actors like Aïssa Maïga, who, if you saw the film last night, Rokaya's film, she's prominently featured in that, who in Noir n'est pas mon métier, this is the book she was referring to where all of these Black actors, 16 different women, tell their stories about what it is to be Black in the film industry and in the television industry in France. Or organizations like Afrofemme, which is a Black feminist organization founded here in France. As Fania Noel describes them, quote, Afrofeminists, they were operating largely online, sharing text and analyses, and then became more visible around the year 2013 by problematizing issues in the anti-slavery and anti-colonial struggles, end quote. So these Black French women are always asserting a presence, right? And so rather than thinking about absence and invisibility and where are the women, they're always asserting this presence. And someone who captures that really perfectly, another person, is Leonora Miano, who is originally from Cameroon. She's one of the first people that was really pushing this term Afropéenne here. And she says this, in her play, Écrit pour la parole, she has a piece called Binarité, which is about the binary. And I'll read it in French since I now have 30 seconds left, maybe. A minute left. I'm going to read it in French and then I'll read the translation. Le pays dit, noire ou française. Le pays dit qu'on ne peut pas, qu'on ne peut être que noire ou française. La pensée du pays est binaire, polarisante, limitée. Elle résonne comme une sommation. La pensée du pays sent la fin de la confiance en soi, la fin du pays. La France ne sera pas la France si elle dit noire ou française. These lines from Binarité translate to the country says this, Black woman or French woman. The country says you can only be a Black woman or a French woman. That thinking is binary, it's polarizing, it's limited. It resounds like a summation. The country's thinking feels like the end. The end, and what she asks for, is confidence in a country that will be itself. She says France will not be France if it says Black woman or French woman. So basically what she's saying is that despite what people have called the contradictions, the paradox of French identity, which has often been a point of departure for theorizing the Black presence in France, what these women are saying is, no, 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 we are asserting our presence because we know that there is no Black France, there is no Black Paris without these Black women. Thank you.
Thank you. And I just want to note how both of you are modeling the capaciousness of Farah to give her time to her, I guess, mentee. Right? It's wonderful.
I know, thank you.
Thank you. Jake, Lamar.
Okay, hi, thanks for coming, everybody. Huge thank you to the organizers of this conference. I do lots of literary events. I've rarely taken part in a conference like this one, and it's a thrill and an honor, so thank you. My life story in 7 minutes. I'm just gonna hit some key points. First key point, when I was 12 going on 13, I read Go Tell It on the Mountain by James Baldwin, as I'm sure all of you know, autobiographical first novel by Baldwin, about a kid growing up in a difficult family in Harlem. I was growing up in a difficult family in the Bronx. I was blown away by this book. I asked my teacher, who is James Baldwin? The first thing I remember him saying was, he lives in Paris. A few weeks later, I read Black Boy, Richard Wright's memoir of growing up in Mississippi at the beginning of the 20th century. Both my parents were part of the Great Migration from the rural South to the urban North. I was blown away by that book, and I found out that Richard Wright had lived in Paris. So this was starting to seem like a pattern. It was only later that I discovered Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Gertrude Stein, Henry Miller, the whole crew, and thought, well, maybe someday if I'm a writer, maybe I'll go to Paris. It would be another 20 years before I would get the chance. Next turning point in life, I met a man named Robert Coles, professor at Harvard. He was my thesis advisor. He was a psychiatrist, writer, literary critic. He saved my sanity and then got me a job. As soon as I graduated from Harvard, I started writing for Time magazine. This is 1983 now. Back in those days, Time had this system where they had writers in New York and correspondents all over the world. So I would get a reportage from Central America, the Middle East, Washington, D.C., and it was my job to turn this into the famous Time style. At age 27, I made associate editor. My beloved Uncle James thought, as he said, that's the cat's pajamas. But I felt this cat don't need no pajamas. I needed to write what I wanted to write. When I was 28, got the contract for my first book, a memoir called Bourgeois Blues. that was published in September of 1991. I just want to stress that date because there's been a stream of memoirs by African Americans. Mine came out in September 1991. The book, thanks again to my guardian angel, Robert Coles, that book won a prize called the Lyndhurst Prize, which was just a grant, a 3-year grant. It was enough money to live on. For me, it was like winning the lottery. I thought, here's my chance, I'm going to Paris. I arrived in September of 1993, thinking I would stay for 1 year. Happily, I met Ted Jones. That's Joans. I know there are people here who must have known him. If you don't know him, please read Ted Jones. Great poet, artist, world traveler. He was part of an international surrealism show last year. I went to the Tate Modern and saw it. Ted Jones had a room at the Tate Modern, so he's having a great moment. Through Ted, I met all sorts of great people. I met Michel Fabre through Ted. Eventually, I would go on to meet Barbara Chase Ribou, who's one of my Paris moms. I used to hang out with Ed Clark in his studio in Montparnasse. That first year here, Carrie Mae Weems was here on a residency at the Cité des Arts. She and I hung out a lot. I was having a great time. I stayed a second year, and then at the end of the third year, met the woman I would go on to marry, and just stayed. It's been 30 years now. I started writing novels, and in 2003, started getting published in French, which was an amazing experience. It was around the time I was publishing my fifth book in the States. My first book in French came out, and I discovered French reading culture, which is just completely different from what we know in America. Somewhere in this country, every weekend, there's a literary festival going on somewhere. And there's also just a difference in attitude. I give an example. When I meet a French person for the first time, and I tell them I'm a writer, their first question is, what do you write? When I meet an American for the first time and I tell them I'm a writer, their first question is, would I have heard of you? And it's very revealing. The French person's interested in writing. The American person is interested in, are you a famous writer? Are you a rich and successful writer? Did Oprah pick your book? It's not really about writing, right? I think for a lot of Americans, writing has no intrinsic value. Right. So, it's been a great thing to live in a country where what I do is just respected in a fundamental way. But the longer I stayed in France, the less interested I found America was in my work. Or I shouldn't say America, but the New York publishing industry and the literary and media ecosystem of which it is a part, they just lost interest in me. By 2006, when I was publishing my sixth book, oh my God, in America, 2 minutes, to the usual lack of interest, the second book I'd published in France was being critically acclaimed, widely read, and won a big prize. So at just the moment when avenues seemed to be closing off to me in New York, great big boulevards were opening up for me in France. I've had a wonderful career here. But of course, you want to be published in your native tongue. It's been 17 years since I last published a book in English, but it's happening. This book, Viper's Dream, came out in France in 2021, did very well. It's just come out in the UK a month ago. Viper's Dream, published in the UK. It's getting a fantastic reception. Pick of the week in the crime fiction section of the Times and Sunday Times of London. Pick of the week of the London Review Bookshop, not just for crime fiction, but for all their books. 5-star review in the Telegraph. I've been interviewed on the BBC 3 times in 3 weeks. It's going well. It's coming out in the US in September. September 19th. This will be the first time I've published a book in America in 17 years. So it's been a thrill to meet so many fascinating people here, artists, writers, scholars. You can order this book. You can pre-order it on Amazon right now. If you're in Paris for a few more days, you can buy it at the Red Wheelbarrow Bookshop, the British version. Tomorrow night, I know it's in conflict with the other event that's going on, but tomorrow night at 7 o'clock, Professor Bob O'Mealy will be having a conversation with me about this book at Columbia Global Center's Reed Hall, 7 o'clock. I think I can breathe now. Okay, thank you.
Well done.
And now we will hear from Dr. Tiffany.
Good evening, good evening. I know I'm short on time, but I would be remiss if I didn't reflect a little on my first Black portraitures, which was the one in Florence. I guess that was 2015. And I thought I was coming to a conference. Done a lot of those. But when I walked in this room, and someone mentioned yesterday how this is probably the most beautiful assembled crowd ever, so wonderfully dressed, I met Michaela Angela Davis at that very first Black portraitures and found someone who loved Black women's beauty culture as much as I did and has been a wonderful person to collaborate with. And just found a space of generosity and kindness. It's a magical space, and of course it's all due to Deb Willis and her wonderful team. So just thank you for preparing this feast for us. I always leave here just more inspired to do the work. So I want to turn our attention to the historical right now, our attention to an unlikely and unexplored group of working class Black women who took Paris by storm in the 1930s. And they even stirred up a storm of their own before they ever set foot on that Europe-bound steamship. And I encountered these women, right? This is not Ada Bricktop. This is not Josephine Baker. As important as those Black women are, this is a unique group of women. These were the women who were the mothers and wives of fallen Black servicemen after World War I. And I came to them in the context of my book in progress, which has been going on as long as Black portraitures. And one day I hope to actually say it's actually here at a Black portraitures, but it's coming. And my book project is on African-American international leisure travelers. And I found these women who were the mothers and the wives of these servicemen and saw that they spent some time in France. And so while we often think in our stories of Black Paris about the Harlem Hellfighters and about the brave soldiers of World War I, not all of them came home. And for those who did not come home, there were mothers and there were wives who were sad and waiting for them. So under a federal program, these women, known as the Gold Star Mothers, were among the almost 7,000 American women who lost their sons and their husbands in the war and were invited by the War Department on an all-expense paid trip to Europe to visit the grave sites of their loved ones. These women that I'm going to talk about, the Black mothers, again, are not our typical cast of characters of those who traveled to Paris in the interwar group. They were not elites, they were not musicians, they were not artists, they were not part of the global Black intelligentsia or diasporic activists. These were mainly working class women, many domestic workers, sharecroppers, Sunday school teachers. They were Black mamas and wives whose stories, I believe, can tell us much about the tangled web of leisure, gender, and class, and beyond in the period following the Jazz Age. These women sought to honor their sons' and their husbands' memories, yes, but they also believed they had a right to the city. They wanted to embrace and flaunt their leisure there. And of course, this was not without controversy, because anytime Black women tried to embrace culture and leisure and time for ourselves, that often is the case. So what was the controversy? The controversy was that while the U.S. Armed Forces issued invitations to these Black women, just as they did to the white ones, the women were told up front that they would travel segregated by race and that all European side accommodations and activities would be done separately. And this ignited a firestorm that drew the ire of Black organizations, prominent Black citizens, and practically every Black newspaper throughout the country who openly protested their treatment and urged and implored, really told the Black women that they shouldn't go. And when I tell you this had folks in a tizzy, I can only imagine what Black Twitter would have looked like at the moment. It was led primarily by the NAACP, by many Black newspapermen, from the Washington African American to the Chicago Defender, and they just outright said there is no way that these women should take this trip. They called the women for even desiring to go. They called them race traitors, bad mothers, an affront to Black manhood. And even our favorites, the Black club women of the era, the National Association of Colored Women, got in on it in their newspaper national notes and said, "You have sacrificed your sons. You can sacrifice this trip." Now, maybe it was the image of France in the letters of the sons and husbands that created a hunger for the women to see it. Certainly, they wanted to honor the places where their sons had died. But it also was probably ignited, this desire to see France was probably ignited by reading the Black newspapers. So when Robert Abbott and later on his nieces, elite Blacks, decided to travel to Europe, they came back and wrote 12 articles going over every detail of when they went to Europe. They had pictures about how they were treated. They created this idea that Europe was, particularly France, was a place for Black people to go and get their lives. However, by the 1930s, we begin to see a shift. We begin to see a condemnation as more working class Black people were also expressing desires to go to Europe. And while I'm indebted to the scholarship of historians like Rebecca Plant and Frances Clark for bringing the first ones to bring scholarly attention to the Black Gold Star mothers, their work seems to emphasize the fight over segregation. And while I think it's important to highlight this story as a window into that, I think it's more important to highlight it as a story where there is a window into the tensions surrounding Black leisure at this crucial moment in the 1930s. The 1930s is a period where the old markers of respectability and class were being contested, and the ability to have leisure, the ability to travel were at the center of those discussions. And so after decades of promoting the international travel of Black elites, on their pages, now all of a sudden there's a problem. So for example, we have Carter G. Woodson, who of course studied in the city and came back, writing an article in the early 1930s called Race Element in Paris, Too Fond of Dens of Vice, where he talks about, quote, one of his fellow men of color who dressed up in our typical gay style, his attire of loud clothes, went to the extreme, and above all, he had his hair straightened and packed about his head as if it had been dipped in tar, right? So all of that condemnation of Black working class culture, very similar to the way that Black migrants to the North from the South were also being condemned. We now see that coming into conversations about Black people going to Paris. But these Black mothers and widows could care less. And in the end, only 5 out of the almost 285 who were invited to go did not go. The rest of those women went and they had a good time and wanted to have everyone back home know what a great time they had. So one of the women said in an article, "I had the time of my life." Each pilgrim that was, when they were interviewed by others, talked about the fine time they were having. My favorite is a Mrs. Johnson from Pittsburgh who boasted that she even had a private French maid to herself on the ship. They went to Versailles, they went to the Fontainebleau. They were even entertained by Blacks who were already in the city, like Ada Bricktop. And I mean, they had a ball. Yes, they honored their sons, but they also wanted to show probably other Black working class women that Paris was also a place for them as well. And I think it's important, and part of why I'm wrestling with this story in my own work is to sort of take up the call that the Pleasure Ninja panel has been calling us to at Black Portraitures and other places for years, not just to find the joy and pleasure of these stories, particularly of Black women, but also to get us think about, particularly as historians among us, how do we find an archive of Black joy, right? And so what I plan to do for my research is to go deeper into these women's lives, deeper into their stories, and really get a new perspective on Black Paris, a perspective that has not been told very often in the scholarship and the stories we hear. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And now we will hear from Audrey Edwards.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Pamela NEWKIRK, I'm sorry, for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here. I'm honored. I do have to give a few shout-outs. I feel a bit outclassed. I do not think of myself as an academic intellectual at all. I am a journalist, a reporter, a writer. One of the best definitions I've heard for journalism is that it's the day-to-day telling of history and the running record of what it means to be here. So I want to thank many of the people here who have allowed me to be here and found my Black joy living in Paris. And I'd like you to just raise your hands quickly. I want to thank 3 of the characters in my book, which I'm going to talk about. Joe Lowry, my college roommate of 50 years ago and counting. Bob Tomlinson, my retired Emory art literature professor who's been indispensable. They just arrived, Christian Tessier, my French landlord, and his 97-year-old mother. Raise your hand, Christian. These 3 people are characters in the memoir that grew out of my political runaway when Donald J. Trump was elected president. And I'm one of the people who said, if this man is elected president, I'm leaving the country. And why did I say that? Because I never thought he'd be elected. That was ridiculous. It was absolutely ridiculous. I live in New York. I'm a journalist, but I'm also a real estate broker. And in New York, real estate drives the economy. And all of the big players in real estate in New York knew that Donald Trump was a joke. So for him to be elected was so scary. And one of the things you do as a reporter, if you are a reporter, you operate not so much as an intellectual on the macro level, you're operating on the micro level. You're paying attention to the day-to-day interactions of people and situations that form your views. So my first thing about Donald Trump was that he had never been elected to anything. And I'm sure many of you, if not most of you here, have been elected to something. Hall room monitor. This group, probably captain of the chess club. Department chair at your university. And what does an election of people say? That you are perceived to be a leader. There is something about you that your peers have deemed leader. Donald Trump was not elected ever to anything. So suddenly, he's the president of the United States. Very, very scary. So I said, I'm going to Paris, where I know people. I'm going to hang out for 3 months, the great litmus test. 3 months, America will know it made a mistake. Okay. So I called Christian, who I had met 10 years before. Christian, is your little studio available? It was. So I came, time passed, and in the time that was passing, the Donald Trump horror show was just incredible. In 3 months, he had insulted Maxine Waters, Angela Merkel. He'd come on to Macron, who was cute, canceled all the trade deals, closed the airports, or tried to close the airports to Muslims and other people of color, did things like call the African countries and other black countries shitholes. And I'm like horrified, horrified. So in being horrified and knowing after 3 months I wasn't going back, I said, let me write something for the Huffington Post on why I left, which I did. It went viral, got something like 14,000 likes. And then I thought, well, maybe there's a book in writing about being an American runaway. Is Faith here? Is my agent Faith, is she here?
Yeah, she's there.
Where are you? Thank you, Faith. I bow down to you, too.
Agent to the stars.
And me. I wanted to call this book initially An Old Black Woman in Paris, an old black lady in Paris, and Faith was like, no. Never put old in the title, never put old in the title. But the joke is Trump is old too. He's older than me. So he's old. So I started thinking about writing a book, and I said I wanted the book to come out before the next election. I need some water. I'm so nervous. I'm just taking a water break.
You have 2 more minutes.
Oh, ooh, okay. So long and short, excuse me, in 2 years, thank you so much. In 2 years, I was able to do a book, couldn't find a publisher. Now, I've written 6 other books, all with major publishers. Nobody wanted to touch this for obvious reasons. So I published it myself. Turned out to be the most successful book I've done, not from a money standpoint, but just from a reception standpoint. Big reception I felt in Paris, thanks to Jacques Lamar, who is the power guy in Paris. And when Jacques Lamar takes your book during a Zoom Black History Month event and goes, "This is brilliant," that's all you need. You want to do it again in real time?
The book is brilliant.
Thank you. So the book came out, got a good reception, and now I'm thinking, what am I going to do? Because Donald Trump is still a player. He's the leading contender for the Republican nomination. I find that astounding. Scary, scary. But for me, what's scarier is living in a country where I really do not feel safe. I feel, and I've never felt this, I can go to the Brooklyn Atlantic Terminal Mall shopping and worry that somebody could come and open fire. I used to love riding the subway. I don't have to ride it every day anymore, but now when I sit on the subway, I look at the crazy-looking person sitting across who could have a gun. And it's been very destabilizing at my age. It's been very disruptive in terms of how I plan the rest of my old age, because America, I feel, is dangerous. I just feel it's dangerous. In Paris, I feel safe, I feel respected, but most of all, well, safety is first, but I feel seen. And I will tell you let me take this break, I'm so nervous, excuse me. Oh. Thank you. Okay. Okay, so I'm in Paris. The winter of 2017 was the worst. Finally, spring breaks. I need clothes. I go with little Joe and her friend, little Peggy, to the Printemps department store, the Shishi department store. Now, I've never been one to really shop in Paris because the women are a size 1. I'm 5'10", but we go to Printemps and we get off on the designer floor. And here comes this tall, willowy little French sales girl. She sees me, she runs over, and she goes, "Oh, you're like Michelle Obama." And I'm like, who's she talking about? So now she's grinning and happy, and I'm grinning and happy because, she thinks, but what she said was, you're not, she didn't say, you are Michelle Obama, excuse me, because she saw the 2 little white ladies, they are not Secret Service. So she knows I'm not Michelle Obama. What she says is, you are like Michelle Obama, which means you remind me of her. It's a positive feeling, but I'm not disrespecting you by not seeing you and assuming that you're a tall Black woman, that you are, in fact, Michelle Obama, which is what I love about the French. And I have to tell this story. Pat, do you want to raise your hand? Okay, Pat and I went to the Cannes Film Festival. I did not have my press credentials in order, so I couldn't get in. But I'm trying to negotiate with these little French officials, hoping they would think I'm Viola Davis. They didn't. They didn't. But Pat is waiting for me near one of the yachts. And I come over, we can't get in, Pat. But we had a great time anyway. So I go over to Pat, and she's saying, this white American couple just came by. And the wife came up to me and said, "Are you Beyonce?" And
So we see why you love France. Okay, Audrey. Okay, Audrey. Do you want to end this story so we can get to Bob?
Yes. So again, I'm honored to be here. I'm honored to feel seen, respected, and feel safe. Thank you.
Is the clicker down here? Oh, there it goes. Thank you, Audrey. That was great. And now we will hear from Dr. O'Mealy.
I have to say thanks to Deb and thanks to Nikki and Pamela for this great event. What I want to do is not offer a personal story of being here, although I certainly could do that on maybe on another occasion. I want to talk about my research and how thinking about this panel has made me think differently about Jacques Johnson. I want to make a couple of simple points that when we think of the long 20th century moment that we sometimes call the Harlem Renaissance, we might consider Jacques Johnson. We might consider this sophisticated international moment in which Johnson's example of assertion could challenge us to think across the disciplines and think quite differently about this era. And also to think differently, I think, about Paris as well. Let's see how we do here. It's significant when we think about Johnson across the disciplines to remember that Miles Davis did a wonderful album honoring Jacques Johnson. He said he wanted to make music that Jacques Johnson might have danced to. Jacques Johnson was a dapper figure, and Gerald Early, I think wisely said that we might date the beginning of the Harlem Renaissance with the entrance of Jacques Johnson onto the scene. And once he becomes the world champion, there's a whole different sense of what's going on. There's also a different sense that we might have of the geography of the Harlem Renaissance. He's somebody not born in Harlem, though he certainly cut a figure there too. He's born in the South, in Galveston, Texas, in what might be called the Juneteenth city. So it's interesting to think about him in that context. He became a world traveler, chasing and challenging white boxers who said they would not fight a black man. He lived in Mexico for a while and invited black people to give up the United States and move to Mexico, which he thought was more promising to him. He used his vantage points in Europe and in Mexico to criticize the United States as well as other countries' political and economic policies and racial codes. His example reminds us of Du Bois's color line warning that was not a warning only about the United States. Just a second, I've got to go. But about the color line of the earth. Here's Johnson's first autobiography written in French with an unknown, at this point, journalist. He wrote several autobiographies and got the word out here. Gerald Early's point was that people who never heard of Langston Hughes or Zora Neale Hurston knew what this meant. And then knew that there was a new moment for all of us to consider. Brent Edwards writes about the Harlem Renaissance as an international movement and moment. Du Bois, of course, talked about the 20th century color line at a conference after his trip from Paris to London, and was referring to an international color line. In his piece called "The Souls of White Folk," he's concerned about the new religion of whiteness that seemed to be flooding the planet. I'm thinking about Glissant and Glissant's thesis of moving out and multiplying one's sense of who one is, and certainly that is true of the young man from Galveston, Texas, who became so many things. When we think about the Great White Hope, we often think about a United States Great White Hope and the search by white racist to find somebody who could knock that smile off of Jack Johnson's face, as some people put it. But there were also great brown hopes, Japanese and Chinese people presenting themselves as potential challenges to this man. There was a Native American who said, maybe I'll knock that smile away. Daniel Dawson writes about Johnson or talks about Johnson in his course called Honey is My Knife, his course on black sports. And here he is with a word about Johnson in this kind of international framework.
The course I teach, Honey is My Knife, is about African spirituality.
Wait, I'm going to go back and please turn up the volume a little bit. Let's try it again.
No, the course I teach, Honey is My Knife, is about African spirituality in the Americas. But it also involves athletics. It also talks about African philosophical contribution to athletics in the Americas too. And it's lost. It's not really lost, but it could be real basic. Africans brought the idea that, first of all, athletics should be fun, but also that they should be danced, that the movement should be danced and the movement should be rhythmic, And we see it so much we don't realize that it's a philosophical contribution. We just think of it almost like, well, that's what those Negroes do, as opposed to there's a thought about it. Someone's thought about dance movement, rhythmic movement is superior to a kind of standard cadence.
So Danny has a lot more things to say about this that are very, very eloquent indeed. Johnson makes us think about the categories of this international Harlem Renaissance as something bigger than just literary or musical. Boxers and other sports figures, women as well as men. He makes us think about Renaissance people, indeed, like Zora Neale Hurston, who was so many different things. Johnson himself was a boxer who played the bass fiddle, who wrote the 2 autobiographies at least, and who, at the end of his career in the ring, performed as a pretty good dancer as well, and band leader. And when I asked my mentor, Sterling Brown, when I taught at Howard about the Harlem Renaissance, which he'd seen close up, he told me in typical Sterling fashion, he said, oh yeah, man, I never could make that team. And what he meant by that was that there was, at the Renaissance Ballroom, a basketball team called the Wrens, and that it wasn't something new in sports. They played against the Harlem Globetrotters, who were from Chicago, by the way, and beat the pants off them in the fancy styles that both of them knew about. And so when I teach Harlem Renaissance, I have people writing about major women of the Renaissance across these categories, the Negro Leagues, the baseball in the Renaissance, Harlem Renaissance in Paris and Martinique, and all over the world, choreographers, musicians, gospel music people, tap dancers. It's a very big field. Even if you're just talking about the boxers, there's this figure of Peter Jackson, who was heavyweight champion of Australia and of England. You have this figure who's often brought up in terms of the Harlem Renaissance, Eugene Bullard, who became Eugène Bullard when he got here to France, Bullard, who was a famous club owner, but he was also a pilot, highly decorated, very good dancer, and a boxer, among other things. And so you had people becoming things that they hadn't been before as they moved out. If you look at Battling Siki here in Paris, he's often celebrated, but all too often also dismissed as some sort of primitive figure. But he was a very sophisticated Renaissance figure in his own right as well. Johnson inspired people who were not boxers to be better at what they were doing. And back to well, you have this painting by Raymond Saunders, Jack Johnson. You had Sterling Brown writing about Jack Johnson. In his poem, he said, one thing you left us with, Jack Johnson, one thing before they got you was that courage, and thanks, Jack, for that. James Weldon Johnson met Jack Johnson, no relation, and he said this quiet, soft-spoken man did not seem like a boxer at all, but just a polite youngster, very well dressed, but somebody inspiring to us all. Du Bois defends him for his unforgivable blackness in an essay that gets quoted in the documentary by that name. Ralph Ellison praised Jack Johnson in these terms. He said, yes, T.S. Eliot, yes, other people, yes, Richard Wright, but he said it's that old dancing master, wit, and bull-balled stud Jack Johnson, who's really my mentor, because he knew if you could operate with skill and style, you could rise above all that being a credit to your race crap, because he was a credit to the human race, and because he could make that much body and bone move with such precision to his command, all people men had a chance to beat the laws of probability and anything else that stuck up its head. Ellison praised Wright as the Jack Johnson of our writers, the first time we had somebody who was as randy and courageous and irrepressible as Jack Johnson. In his piece called Juneteenth, he says, you know, we need to get with the rhythm. We need to dance on out of the way like Jack Johnson did. Albert Murray praises Johnson as the person, he said, every time he stepped into the ring, he crossed the color line. And as a writer, he says, that's what I want to do. I want to step across that color line every time I pick up my pen. When we think about Johnson, who was forced to give up the crown, it's Murray, among many others, who says that when he was supposedly knocked out, he was actually just shading his eyes from the Cuban sun while he waited to go back home. And so, as I finish up, I want to make the point that it's important that he was considered a first black movie star. That the films that were made of him circulated very widely and were seen underground. When they were banned, they were all the more popular. We can see a little bit of this here. He was a fine-looking man who liked to pose for the camera. He was a dresser. Who, as he traveled around the earth, was known for these kinds of exhibitions of his prowess, dancing and showing off for black and white men in particular, although many white women in particular came to see him fight, which became a problem as well. He would talk trash in the ring. If you look at the footage, you hear him say what we heard elsewhere, that he said, you know, you can't hit me here, you can't. Where did you learn to box? Did you learn it from your mama? Watch him here as he talks stuff to the boxer here. He says, yeah, okay, I see you, you know, you better look out for the next round, my brother. So he's on camera looking great, and I think inspiring people, black people in particular, around the world. Here he is in his famous fight where he wins the championship, and it's being filmed, and finally the police move to the camera people and stop the filming, because this is not the whipping of the black boy that people had counted on seeing. So that's all we get to see of that, because it's banned. Here's Crouch, Stanley Crouch, the writer, talking about Johnson, who was a dancer, who was honey with a knife on screen. Bring up the sound, please.
What a boxer ideally wants to do in the ring is turn the opponent into an assistant in his own ass whipping. That's really what you want the other guy to do, to assist you in whipping his ass. Now, Jack Johnson, it seems to me, figured out ways of getting people into positions where they could be hit and do different kinds of things to throw them off balance, and to do the same kind of things that magicians do. The magician is always trying to get you to look in a different direction from where the trick is actually being brought off. Johnson was beginning to develop.
Okay, so there were problems with his many white girlfriends and wives, which made him unpopular all over the place, and finally got him arrested. He was part of a diaspora of black travelers, and I really am winding up. I do love Rashida Bragg's discussion of a jazz diaspora and of these black travelers. So Johnson is on the move, chasing the white boxers. He didn't want to fight him, and then eventually is part of this movement of intellectuals and artists as well as musicians traveling the world and making the world a larger place for everybody concerned. In this book, which is also very fine, Teresa Runstedler puts Johnson as part of the rebel sojourners traveling the earth. Musicians, fighters, circus attractions, and brilliant people of all sorts. The final point I want to make is that when we look at this figure and the French, I think one thing that you see is that they're celebrating him when they are celebrating him. Sometimes they're denigrating him, but when they're celebrating him, bragging about France as a free place and at the expense of the United States. And what they're able to do, as Runstedler points out, is to ignore their own crimes all over the world, using Johnson as a kind of foil against which they can brag in ways that are certainly suspicious. If I had more time, look up this clip of Wynton Marsalis and the Unforgivable Blackness rehearsal. That's pretty great. In that clip, the song is, "What Have I Done?" Well, what had he done? He had challenged white supremacy all over the world, not just in the United States. What had he done? He had lived a life of defiance, a defiance of the deficit model of black life. Things you've mentioned. What had he done? He had rode around in big cars and wearing big jewelry, traveling where he wanted to, having wives and girlfriends that he wanted. The legacy that Danny Dawson talks about as an African legacy of a specific style of boxing is something that you see in Muhammad Ali, certainly as the legacy continued. And I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. It's something when I can make this distinguished panel like actually stick close to the time. So we have a little bit more time, which is remarkable. So if we have questions from the audience, yeah, Mike is coming.
Hi. Well, first of all, let me congratulate the speaker. Excellent presentation. I just wanted to add, for those who are not really familiar with battling Siki Louis Fall, you know, of course, he was Senegalese. So in the narrower French context, he was most famous for beating the white French champion, light heavyweight champion, Georges Carpentier. And so in that narrower French context, I think carried out the same kind of dynamic that you were talking about.
Definitely.
Thank you. Questions? I think there's someone else here.
Thank you. I just wanted to thank you for a really great presentation and just say that it was interesting to hear Dr. Gish about the
Gill?
Oh, sorry, thank you. Gill, about the mothers coming because Eugene Bullard came, and one of the issues he had was that all of them were forced to travel in steerage. And that was really interesting to me to hear the way you talk about it. And I'm really thankful for your bringing the joy of what it was for them, because that was the truth.
Yeah, I mean, just for sure. I mean, I think there's a really rich history that I'm sort of working through in my work, that we have a sense of how African Americans had to negotiate segregation and Jim Crow when traveling within the U.S. Think of Mia Bay's work and others. But we don't have a sense of what that looked like when folks are going abroad. And it's a very complicated issue that it's either coming from State Department mandates or it's coming from the individual the steamship companies, et cetera. And so part of what I'm trying to do is sort of navigate through that and to show the real segregation, but also not to lose sight of the ways that even navigating that segregation, how African Americans, particularly women and working class folks, are also able to find joy in these spaces. So I'm really trying to build an archive of kind of finding the joy within even these, difficult situations that they found themselves in.
Which so often gets lost in our conversations. Yeah.
Oh, hi. This is a really wonderful, wonderful panel. Thank you all so much. I actually wanted to ask you a question, Pamela, as moderator, but also someone who is teaching a course about Paris Noir. If you could please just share with us, and maybe for some of the students in the room, how this panel perhaps might relate to some of your teaching and what you're finding in especially some of the historical sites in and around the city of Paris.
Yeah.
Merci.
There you go. Well, it's actually been fascinating to see Paris. As you know, I was here last year for 2 months on a research fellowship. I've been digging into archives and going to, retracing the steps of Josephine Baker and James Baldwin, and making that pilgrimage that so many of us from America have made, right? Paris holds a really special place for African Americans, even as we recognize the tension with the colonial history. So I've been sort of interrogating that tension, and also looking at what Dr. Gill was just talking about, the joy in trying to hold a space for that as well. So in teaching this class, I'm teaching a class for NYU Abu Dhabi. And so my students, are any of my students here? I don't see any. But so my students are from all over the world. I have a student from Japan. I have a student from Ghana. I have, a student from China. So they're bringing a very multi-dimensional perspective to everything that they're seeing. They read Black Boy. They read Notes of a Native Son. They've gone to the spaces where Josephine Baker was. They went to the Pantheon to pay homage to her. I think I've been struck by, Josephine Baker is a very complicated figure. In the United States, she's mainly recognized for sort of the, shimmying around nude. And I think people were, my students were really blown away by the way in which she is revered here. To make it into the Pantheon, that is remarkable. So they watched the ceremony, they watched the full military honor she received, and it's just a way that she's almost never seen in the United States. So, we're looking at, the complicated history of race, but they're also seeing African Americans in a new way and in a new context, and understanding why it is Paris was the magnet for so many of them. Thank you for that question.
Hello. I'm sorry, oh my gosh, I'm a little nervous to ask you. But I've been reading a lot of James Baldwin, of course, as I live here and try to navigate my Blackness and my Americanness. And James Baldwin says that his journey or his flight had not been to Paris, but simply away from America. And that also, to me, implies the relinquishing of American power. And so I wanted to ask you, anyone on the panel, if you have some ideas about this. How does your Americanness and your Blackness interact as you live here in France and in Paris? Do you have that American power still as someone who comes from this nation, or is this something that you also desire to relinquish?
Well, I'll respond quickly. In one of my books, one of my novels, Rendezvous 18th, which is set in Paris, it's a lot about the African American community in Paris. I have a character say that there were 3 types of African Americans in Paris, in France in general. There were those who wanted Paris to be just like America. They only hung out with other Americans. They only spoke English. They never learned French. They didn't know any French people. Then there's a second type of African American who disappears into France. Usually they have a French spouse. They only speak French. They shun other Americans and African Americans. And then there's the third type, the betwixt and between, which is where I place myself and most of my friends. It took me a while, but I got a handle on the language here. I have good friends I've never spoken English to. At the same time, I cherish my friendships with the American community, especially the African American community. I am acutely aware of the fact that my status here is different from that of my friends from Africa, North Africa, the Caribbean. I've been stopped by the police any number of times in this country for no other reason than the color of my skin. The minute I open my mouth or show the American passport or the carte de résidence, I don't have a problem. So I would say, just in a nutshell, I think one thing that's big difference between France and America, difference between America and Europe in general, is the difference between slavery and colonialism. I could go on for that for a long time, but it makes things just more layered and complicated here when it comes to things that we call racial questions.
We have time for
Real
one
quickly,
more.
I do think the American mystique, the power of America in Paris, in France, and other parts of the world is on the decline. I do think people looking at the United States now have a very different view than what they had 5, 10 years ago. America's a different place, and people see that. They see it around the world.
But as an African American, what is your experience? I think you were saying how you felt seen and respected in a way here that you are not in the United States.
Absolutely. I don't feel that race is in my face constantly. In the United States, race is in my face. It just is. And I don't think, I got into this is a real quick discussion with a biracial Uber driver last night. And our argument was, I think America's much better than France. That was his argument. He'd gone to high school in the United States. And I said to him, he was in his 30s, where were you in the United States? I'm thinking he's going to say New York, California. He said Kansas. I said, Kansas? Okay, that's a different reality. You know, you're cute. In Kansas, you were probably the exotic kid in high school. So his experience was based on a particular context, a particular place. My experience here is based on personal interactions. And a really quick story, I was living in this She 6, I'm coming out of the building, I'm behind a little petite French woman. It's winter, I have on my boots, clunk, 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 I'm tall. She doesn't even turn around. And when I pass her, she said, bonjour, madame. She didn't clutch her bag. She didn't do any weird, I'm afraid of you, I'm threatened by you. She was confident, she was comfortable. She was giving me, what we talk about a lot, my basic humanity.
We have time for one more question.
I have the mic. I would like to ask Dr. Gill, with regard to your book about leisure and international travel, is it across decades? What is the time frame, and where are the places that you're talking about?
Sure. It's a big sweeping book, which is probably why it's taken me so long. But from World War I, because I talk about how World War I, and even with these Gold Star mothers, but really the experience of Black GIs, really from World War I, sort of has this kind of awakening factor for Black travel, all the way up through the contemporary, what millennials have called the new Black travel movement, which I show is not really new. And so, yeah, so it's a sweeping one, and it is organized geographically. It's mainly Europe, the African continent, and the Caribbean, although I do touch on travelers that went to Asia a bit, but those three are the main focus.
Pamela, can I make one remark before we close out?
Deb is looking at me, but as long as she allows it.
Oh, okay. Okay. In response to the woman's question about coming here, I think about Baldwin said that he had to come here to learn to listen to Mahalia Jackson. and to come here to finally listen to the blues and to hear the beauty of black language. He also said he came here to finally listen to Shakespeare and accept that. And I've taught a course off and on here about being black in Paris. And I remember one year, over 10 years ago, a student told me that when she, African American, that when she was on her way here, her mother said, "Don't come back with no Frenchman. You can come back.
Yeah.
And remember who you are." And I found myself teaching off of that through the semester and using Glissant to talk about how she could do what Baldwin had done, maybe discover what it meant to be black while here.
And didn't Baldwin also say what he loved about Paris is that white people just left him alone?
Yeah, they left there, right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I would just say remain open and expect a miracle, as they say in church. You know, that's the things happen here.
The gentleman there has a question.
Oh, well, okay.
Real quick question to the who I consider the artist on the panel, the journalist, this romanticized notion of Paris and France being so much better than the United States from an artistic point of view. I'd like to ask you about the practical. Do the gigs, musical or journalistic, pay more here than they do in the United States, asking for a friend?
Actually, what you have here is state support for the arts in the form of grants, residencies. For instance, I've spent a lot of time in neighborhoods a lot of Americans in Paris never go to, in what's known as the suburbs, the banlieue. The neighborhoods like Bondy and Bobigny, immigrants, children of immigrants. I spent 10 years working at a theater there, working as a theater consultant, but also doing outreach, doing workshops in high schools in the banlieue. I was paid for this and was able to do my writing. That these residencies are set up so that you can write at the same time that you're doing good for, little kids, teaching them about literature and journalism. So there's support, the French radio, I've worked a lot in French radio. French radio pays quite well. It's supported by the state. It's Radio France. And I've gotten to do really fun, fascinating, artistic things that I don't think I would have had a chance to do in the United States. So I think there is a general sense that culture is important, that the state supports it, and that's the big difference. Otherwise, no, gigs don't pay any better here than they do in the States.
Well,
real quick.
Wait, Audrey, we really do have to go. We have a hard close at 6:30 because the lights are going to go out, the mics are going to go out. Thank you so much. This was wonderful.
It is a hard close.
I mean, it finally, fizzled out, but no, I was there from 2000.
Thank you. What a wonderful panel. I'm really excited to hear the stories. I love the girlhood stories that shared by Farah and Regine because they were part of my fantasy, when I was a college student and meeting, another girl and having those experiences and sharing these moments. The fact that Jake, you moved here at a time when you were questioning all of those wonderful moments and talking about black travel. All three of you, the last three, talked about black travel from the 19th century to turn of the 20th century to now, and talk about politics and music and sports. It's just a wonderful way to look at this and to wrap up this two-day event. I am so honored. It meant a lot to me when Cheryl and I were talking about the possibilities of this panel a few years ago, and we kept saying, no, we're not going to do it. No one has funded us. So I think you need to write to funders to say, hey, what's happening? There's no major funding for this project. And they don't believe that we can have a conversation about beauty, about joy, about pain, because there was some pain on the curators panel. So we have to recognize that there's some black pain, but we also know that there's so many different stories that we need to explore. And I understand that we need to move on, and Kira's going to guide us out because Cheryl's going to wrap it up. So thank you all. Okay.
Okay, I think I have about 30 seconds because it's 6:29 on my phone, and I just want to. Okay. Anyway, I just wanted to end with some acknowledgments of deep, deep, deep gratitude. I'd like to thank Anna Laban. And Anna, could you please come down or stand up so that everyone can see you? Anna, we worked with Anna a decade ago. We've talked to and we've acknowledged so many of you who've been supporting Black portraitures for this past decade. Anna is one of those people from the very beginning, so we just want to thank you so much for your partnership, for opening up this wonderful, wonderful space for us, the Quai Branly, a decade ago, and also this time around. Thank you. We don't have to wait that long. Okay, let's do it again. All right. Also, we just want to say, again, so much gratitude to everyone in the tech booth. You've really helped everything run so smoothly. Nikki Keikos. Nikki, come on down. Nikki, please. Jordan Cruz, are you there, Nikki? Thank you so much again. Kira Williams. Where's Kira? Kira is our new MC, okay? So we're really, really happy for your participation and help. So we also just wanted to say a big round of gratitude to all of the moderators, to the panel organizers. You know, this was a team effort, and there's so many great minds that went into thinking about and organizing these 2 days of conversations and events. To all of the speakers, to the artists, to the students, to the teachers, to all of you who are here, to our friends, and to all of you who've traveled from so far away. Tiffany, I hope this might be like an addendum. Maybe it's the you know, the coda to your book. And then lastly, just 2 points of order. I think maybe you're going to lead us out, Kira, with this evening and then tomorrow. Yes? Okay.
And
yes?
Just one, Joan, do you want to add anything tonight? Joan, you're still here? Yeah, Joan. Joan Morgan? I told someone earlier, I felt like, you know, I grew up in a Baptist church, North End Baptist Church, and there was Miss May Ray, you know that lady, the Sunday school teacher, who would just rally up to say, okay, now we have to go to class. And I felt as if I had an intensive class of Bible study, of love study, of jazz studies, of everything about love. And it really felt that, and I know a number of people have walked up to me to thank me who I don't know, will probably not see again. But the fact is that this was an intensive study class, a session that a semester, we couldn't get this in a semester. And I'm just so honored by this experience. Like Justin is here from Florence, and he's doing the same thing in Florence of bringing people together. And so I hope you all have a chance to meet Justin tonight, and Kira will tell you where you'll meet him, and then he can invite us to, all of us, to Florence.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you everyone so much. Quick logistics. Please mindfully and groundedly, but expediently, make your way into the hall. The panelists will pose for a photo and then do the same. Thank you all. Tonight, we'll have a reception at the Marianne Ibrahim Gallery. So grateful for that partnership in space. Tomorrow, we'll be at the Little Africa Paris, space for an exhibit and a closing reception, and that's at 6:30. And I think Google is your friend. I will try to help if you come and see me. And Cheryl can give the address in an accent probably better than mine. Thank you all very much.
So for this evening, the reception begins at 7. It's at 18 Avenue Matignon. So it begins at 7. It's walking about 30 minutes, or I'm sure there's a metro or a car too. And a bus, yes.
And lastly, we extend thanks to the interpreters. Thank you very much as well.